more than this, so much more than
The way I find people generally is I read a lot of old newspapers and old magazines, old periodicals. That's where you find things that have been forgotten. I don't look at any of my contemporaries. I don't look at any current histories because by definition, those are the people who are being remembered. So I spend just a lot of time looking at old newspapers from the 1700s, 1800s. And anytime I see something and I read it and I go, what the hell is that? That's when I know I've found something. And I'll look and see if anyone else has written about it. And sometimes they have, and I just hadn't heard of it. But a fair amount of the time, it turns out nobody has. And that's when I have the beginning of a story. And there were a couple that didn't make it into Banvar's Folly. One was actually a woman named Victoria Woodhull, who was, she was the first female candidate in a presidential election in the US in 1896. Almost all her votes were thrown out because they just didn't want a woman running. But she was one of the first women stockbrokers on Wall Street, and she was kind of a controversial character at the time, and a life with many ups and downs, and so she really intrigued me. But as I was working on the book, I hadn't started on a chapter on her yet, but as I was doing the book, not one but two books about her came out at the same time. So I thought, well, okay, I think I think this is well covered now. The other extreme was actually, it always bothered me that there are 12 men and one woman in the book, and that's partly because since it's mostly in the 1700s and 1800s, to have tremendous failures, you also have to be allowed to succeed tremendously, and women weren't back then. They were just too constrained in what they were allowed to do. So that made it difficult to find women who fit in the book, but the two that got lost were both women. Victoria Woodhull was one, and another one who really intrigued me was a woman named Ella Cheever Thayer, and she wrote a book called Wired Love, and it's an online romance novel that came out in 1878. It's between two telegraph operators, man and woman. They've never met each other. They're not even entirely sure if the one's really a man and the other's really a woman, and they have this online relationship, and when they meet, it's actually very awkward, and they decide they liked it better when they were talking by telegraph. And so, you know, you read it today, and it's just very, it's strangely reminiscent of our own time. But she was a very tough nut to crack historically. There was nothing out there about her. She had, I mean, the people that I was writing about have been forgotten, but there were at least materials that I could find on them. There was nothing about her. Nobody even knew when she lived, when she died, where she was born, anything. All they had was a book and a name on it and a year. And eventually, it took me a couple of years, 2 or 3 years. I eventually had enough to write an article about her for New Scientist magazine. But that was about 2 years after the book came out. So I would have loved to have had her in there, but that was a very tough one to write. That's actually been one of the really gratifying things about the book, is that some of the people covered in it have had people subsequently studying them. I've been contacted several times by graduate students who are working on dissertations on one of the people in the book. And I know in at least 1 or 2 of the cases it was because they had heard about these people from the book. And actually, before the book even came out, the chapter on Banvar had run in McSweeney's, which was this quarterly that Dave Eggers was doing. And not long after that, someone put together, 2 things happened. One was that a rock band did a song about Banvar. They sent me a CD of it in the mail. And then someone in St. Louis put on a stage production about John Banvar, which apparently got started because of them reading the story. So that was kind of nice to see that happening. Unfortunately, in Banvar's case, because apparently almost none of his paintings have survived, really all we have is his story. It's almost impossible to ever truly revive him as an artist because we've lost his art.
more than this, so much more.